this is the first time that I'm going to present on this particular topic. So you got the exclusive on some results of an empirical study that I've been conducting since last September here at the University of Oslo. Okay. So it's going to be a very kind of informal presentation because I'm just starting to explore on these particular issues. So what is this talk about? As I said, in this talk, I'm going to share with you some results of an empirical study on the implementation of the so-called RRI, or Responsible Research and Innovation, which is basically an emerging science policies and science governance framework, which has been developed since 2010 by the European Commission, and which is going to be hopefully implemented in many research conducting universities and universities in the European community. My case study will be Pinpoint. Pinpoint is an ongoing multi-year, multidisciplinary research project on personalized oncology, and I'm going to explain what it is. However, I really want to stress that even though I'm going to talk to you about an empirical case study, I'm not a sociologist. So my project is inscribed in the emerging tradition of the so-called empirical philosophy. So even though I do some sociological and empirical work, my aims are philosophical, and empirical philosophy basically amounts to drawing new concepts or challenging some established conceptual distinctions by looking at the actual empirical scientific communities and research teams. Okay, so as I said before, this project of mine is actually connected to the so-called RRI, Responsible Research of Innovation, which is only the latest of a number of science governance approaches which have been developed from the end of the Second World War until today. So in the 70s, there were like these governmental offices of technology assessment. Then in the 90s, there was the so-called constructive technology assessments. And then starting from the 90s, there were like two slightly complementary but slightly competitive frameworks. One which was the so-called ELSI program developed in the States, and then there was the ELSA program, which was the sort of European version of the American ELSI program. But both ELSI and ELSA were developed especially to look at the ethical, legal, and social implications or aspects of the study of the DNA structure, and then the genetical modification, and so on and so forth. Responsible research and innovation is the latest addition to these science governance approaches. And the focus is not just on the morally controversial genetic studies, but also to the so-called innovation studies. So there is a major focus on technology, such as, for instance, robotics, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. And RRI is also developed within these broad movements about open science, the democratization of science, and so on and so forth. So, as I said before, responsible research and innovation is a governance framework which the European Commission is trying to implement in research conducting institutions in Europe. The problem with the implementation is that it is not always extremely clear what RRI actually amounts to. And in fact, there are competing and sometimes even conflicting definitions of what RRI is supposed to mean. So there are some people who actually define responsible research and innovation as consisting of 4 procedural dimensions, as they call them in the RRI literature. And these dimensions are anticipation, reflexivity, inclusivity, and responsiveness. Other RRI scholars define RRI in terms of 5 essential keys, like ethical reflection, public engagement, open access, gender equality, and science education. There is also the sort of a philosophical issue of trying to understand whether responsible research and innovations refers to a process that is conducting research responsibly, or to a product, that is whether RRI is the final product of a process. But nevertheless, all these different definitions, complementary, sometimes conflicting definitions, seems to share one main idea, which is the idea which connects the notion of responsibility with the ability of anticipating the potential impacts, implications, and consequences of a particular piece of scientific or technological research. And in fact, one of the most basic definitions of RRI defines this science governance approach as an approach that anticipates and assesses potential implication and societal expectation with regard to research and innovation. Of course, the problem here is, as I said, that there's a lot of literature on the conceptual and foundational issues. I myself, I was part of, during my last appointment in France, I was part of one of the Horizon 2020 projects on the definitions of these different keys of RRI. But as I said before, the main idea of RRI is the ability of anticipating potential societal consequences of research. This means that the main philosophical idea that to be responsible implies the ability of anticipating the consequences of one's own actions or a particular team research. But to anticipate something, of course, means to be able to think about the future. And then the philosophical problem here is that actually future can be a rather vague concept, and even the very term future actually might mean different things. Therefore, what I'm going to do in this talk and what I did in my research is to actually problematize the anticipative reflection, which is supposed to be at the basis of responsible research. Okay, I follow here partially a taxonomy of different kinds of futures related to different kinds of different notions or different ideas of responsibilities developed by Christopher Gruss and collaborators. So Christopher Gruss and Adam as well in this particular paper, but Gruss has written extensively on the connection between different kinds of futures and different ideas of responsibility. So we can imagine the future in what Gruss defined as an empty future. An empty future is basically a neutral extension of the present. An empty future is not qualitatively different from the present. And for instance, what it is considered to be good or bad in the present will be considered good or bad in the empty future. So basically, we do not regard the empty future as something which can even be radically different from the present, but only as this sort of a neutral, innocuous continuation of the present, or actually as a sort of an empty container waiting to be filled by the protraction of the present. Connected to the idea of empty future, there is the idea of responsibility as avoiding harm. So to be responsible for someone who thinks about the future as empty means to behave in order not to harm other people. But then there is another kind of future that Bruce talked about, which is the lived future. And the lived future is not a neutral extension of the present, but it is actually the result of a transformative process which begins in the present and then concludes in the future. So the idea of responsibility connected to this kind of future is a different, a more proactive way of being responsible. So in this sense, responsibility becomes applying values in the present to transform the present and construct a better future reality. To make an example, if someone thinks about the future, about an empty future, that person would regard responsible the action of not leaving a broken glass on the park. Because if someone leaves the broken glass in the park, maybe that broken glass might actually hurt some child who's playing in the park in the future. However, from this perspective, it is not even important when the child could be harmed, because whether a child is going to be harmed in 5 minutes or in 2 weeks, the idea of harming someone does not change, because again, we are thinking about an empty future. In the second case, if we think about a lived future, we would be responsible if we started to think how to change the park, for instance. So we can have a look at the park. We can see that there are no any baskets for recycling glass. We're throwing away the glasses. So we can start a petition to ask to the mayor to actually put the baskets in the park. And so in this case, our sense of responsibility will be more proactive than responsibility in the pure minimal sense of just avoiding harm. So, of course, when I talk about anti-future and responsibility in this sense, I've been talking about individual responsibility. Even my example of the person leaving or not leaving a broken glass in the park is the example of an individual responsible or irresponsible person. Of course, when we say that we want our science and technology to be socially responsible, we are not talking about an individual. We are not talking about one particular scientist and one specific engineer. We are talking about a collective institution, which is made of many different interacting, cooperating individuals. However, what I said before about the individuals may actually hold true also for collective responsibility. And in fact, if we collectivize future thinking, we can say that if a research community thinks about the future as an empty future, then that research community, that research team will regard itself as being responsible if it will adopt precautionary principle and if it will reflect on inductive risks, for instance, in order to avoid harm to society. And the moral theory of this kind of this version of responsibility is traditional classical utilitarianism. However, if a research community thinks about the future as a lived future, then that community will look itself as contributing to a transformative process. So as contributing in a proactive way to the moral and social development of society. And in this case, the moral theory that we use cannot be just basic traditional utilitarianism anymore. And in fact, in philosophy, of science and technology, there is a lot of debate on which kind of moral theory actually can justify this sort of this version of responsibility, whether we should adopt new technological imperatives as Jonas theorized in the 80s, or whether better moral theory would be care ethics or virtue ethics for scientists and technologists, and so on and so forth. But again, in this talk, I'm not going to defend any particular moral theory, because it might be the case that in order for science and technology to be responsible, they should be responsible in all these different ways. So I'm not treating utilitarianism and new imperatives and virtue ethics as a conflicting, but as a different parts of a whole, which might actually be bigger than the sum of the different parts. My problem here is to try to understand, indeed, which kind of future and therefore which kind of responsibility is thought by and endorsed by actual scientists in our research teams. Okay, this is a little bit to sum up what I've been saying before. So we got to two different kinds of future: empty future, which underlies the avoiding harm of the precautionary principle in the notion of responsibility, or a lived future, which might lead to a sort of social activism or responsible transformative innovation, with different moral theories justifying or explaining this kind of responsibilities. The philosophical questions that here I'm attempting to answer are several. So first of all, within a multidisciplinary research team, because again, I'm talking about responsibility at the collective level, so not at the level of the individual, but at the level of the community that that individual belongs to. So within a multidisciplinary research team, who think about which kind of future, and also what skills, even what kind of cognitive skills are actually needed to be able to think about the future, because future thinking is something that as individuals we can all do. I mean, even when we go, for instance, to job interviews, one of the most common questions is, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And we are all able to at least imagine how we would like to be in 5 or 10 years' time. Because in that case, we are thinking about our own future based on the evaluation of our present beliefs and desires about ourselves. However, to be able to anticipate the potential impact of a research project which is conducted by a large team in which people from different backgrounds and from different disciplines actually collaborate, might require slightly different cognitive skills. But this is a question that not many people actually ask. And even at the level of science governance, it seems that this kind of question is not really thematized. I mean, many policymakers, they just say to implement the anticipative thinking in research communities without telling the research communities what do they need to do in order to think and to anticipate the future. And indeed, this leads me to the last question. Okay, are we sure that everybody in a research team can actually anticipate the future impacts of the research? And can you actually teach to researchers to think about the future? Is future thinking, which is so necessary and so tied with the idea of responsibility, can actually be taught? So this is the case study. that I'm going to present to you. Pinpoint, this is literally, they call it the pipeline, because the whole project looks like a pipeline a little bit. So Pinpoint is a multi-year, multidisciplinary research project in personalized oncology. So personalized medicine, I'm not going to delve too long in this, because there will be also a lot of philosophical discussion about the emerging paradigm of personalized medicine, which basically attempts to give tailored cures to individual patients based on their DNA and genetic makeup. So this, sorry, I got something going on here. Sorry about the interruption. Okay, so this project in particular is about personalized oncology with a special focus for different kinds of blood cancers. So how does the Pinpoint pipeline work? So there are at least 3 different institutions, three different physical places involved in this project. So we got the University of Oslo Hospital, which actually gives to the Institute of Cancer Research some genetic material extracted by consenting patients. Of course, there are some patients who decided to volunteer and to participate to this project. At the Institute of Cancer Research, there are 2 different teams working on this project. So the first team is actually working in multiple myeloma, which is one kind of blood cancer, and which is therefore receiving not only blood, but also bone marrow. And then there is another group which is working on different kinds of leukemia. Basically, they run some empirical experiments in which they actually give, so to cure cancer, you cannot give only one drug to the patients, as we all know and we are all aware. You must give a combination, the so-called cocktails of drugs. The problem here is that because of individual variation, one particular combination of drugs might be extremely successful in one patient and might not work at all in another patient. So basically, the Institute of Cancer Research, they have this genetic material, and they also have a library of more than 60 approved anti-cancer drugs. And basically, they give different combinations and different in different doses of drug combinations to the cells of the patients. The amount of data is actually huge. That's why actually from the Institute of Cancer Research, they send the data obtained to the Institute of Biostatistics, in which again, there are 2 different groups. So the first group is receiving the statistical data, the data from the experimental data from the Institute of Cancer Research, and they are working on developing a particular software which will allow them to recognize the statistical relevance of particular drug combinations for particular specific genetic makeups. And then there is another group at the Department of Biostatistics in which they are working for developing an AI-based mechanistic model, which might work as a predictive tools and which basically can actually tell which kind of patients should receive which kind of drug combination and in which particular doses. Then eventually these results will be given back to the Institute of Cancer Research and then applied at the hospital. Okay, I don't want to delve too much on the methodological procedure that I took in order to develop this case study. I only want to notice that in order to study the way in which the members of the research team actually engage with the future thinking, and therefore with the idea of anticipating the potential consequences at the social level of their research, I first started to look at the traditional qualitative studies of epistemic groups, the so-called laboratory studies. However, I've noticed that this kind of studies, and there is a huge literature, starting from Latour until the most recent one by Nancy Nersessian and many others, I've noticed that these qualitative empirical studies of epistemic groups, research teams, and so on and so forth are mainly concerned with the epistemic issues. That is, with the issue of knowledge construction in cooperative scientific research teams. Some recent exception, but actually the only one that I managed to find, is a paper recently published by Lee and other authors about the level of engagement with ethical reflection in an American engineer laboratory. And in fact, it is from this particular paper that I was actually inspired to develop my own methodology. There is also another thing to be said, that one thing is to study what is going on inside the laboratory. Another thing is analyzing a research team. The two concepts are different because, for instance, a laboratory is a place in which there are always the same people working, and they might work on different research projects. So in one laboratory can be attached to 2, 3, or 4 or several different research projects. A research team is attached to a research project, but as I showed you by describing you the pipeline, the research project is conducted in different places at the same time. This makes the so-called site observation a little bit more complicated, and in my case, it was even more complicated by the fact that this whole study took place during the COVID pandemic. However, I must say that I did quite a few site observation at the Institute of Cancer Research because they had to go to work anyway, because otherwise the cells that they received from the hospital would have died. So for the Institute of Cancer Research, it was business as usual. It was a little bit different for studying the dynamics of the Institute of Biostatistics. And then there is also the methodological critique that one can say, what's the usefulness of a case study? So of course, case studies can be useful. I'm not aiming here for a statistical relevancy, even because, as I said before, I'm not a social scientist. I am engaging in this kind of studies for philosophical reasons. So anyway, the case studies may become exemplars and inspire future studies, or in my case, might actually help me to clarify some conceptual distinctions. The methodology was interventional, my theoretical background was ground theory. If you want, you can ask me some questions about the methodology a little bit later on. So the main bulk of my study was this semi-structured interview, which revolved around the 4 basic questions of the so-called STEER protocol. But again, I don't want to bore you too long with these sort of details, which, however, the social scientists like a lot. But here is my sample: 13 people, 8 people from the Institute of Cancer Research, 4 for each group, the group of multiple myeloma and the multiple of leukemia, 5 people from the Institute of Biostatistics, 2 people working on the statistical device, and the other one on the mechanistic model, and so on and so forth. Feel free to ask me for clarifications later on. So then the problem is, how do I know which kind of future do the researchers of Pinpoint have in mind? So, of course, the kind of future thinking that researchers have in mind can be understood and reconstructed and interpreted by looking how they consider impact. In fact, some of the questions of my interview were about the future impact. So who might be affected in the future? What could go wrong? What do you think is going to happen after the conclusion of Pinpoint? And so on and so forth. These are all questions aiming at uncovering the modality of future thinking in researchers. And they realized that actually when researchers are asked to anticipate the potential impact of their research, as I said, they engage in an exercise of future thinking. But in this particular case study, again, without having any pretense of statistical validity, usually researchers are able, or they talk about two different kinds of impacts, which I define as internal impact and external impact. And it is very curious that usually when we talk about the impact of a research, we take for granted that we are talking about the impact that research might have in society. But instead, many researchers also actually first and foremost talk about the so-called internal impact, which is the impact that a research might have within the research community itself and for furthering future research. Then they also talk about external impact, which is the impact that the research might have on society, therefore outside the world of research. But of course, I didn't limit myself in noticing that when we talk about impact with researchers, researchers are actually talking about two different kinds of impacts. But it is also important here to notice how they talk and they conceptualize these different kinds of impacts. So here are some examples of how people talk about internal impact. Of course, I anonymized all the people that I interviewed. So Alice, Anthony are just made up names. So when asked about the impact of Pinpoint, Alice replied that, of course, Pinpoint will have an impact on other researchers who are doing the same work like us, because we provide the new knowledge. Anthony said that the project can affect the research community. So Pinpoint the research community first, but also it might have an impact on the scientific community at large, like the international community of researchers. So how do researchers talk about internal impact, and to which kind of future is internal impact associated? So internal impact is associated to a sort of definitive medium-term empty future. So researchers who talk about the internal impact of the research, they know when this impact, more or less, of course, they know which kind of impact that is going to be, and when this impact is going to be obtained. So when I ask them when they think that there will be this kind of impact, they usually say that Pinpoint will make an impact in the research community by the end of this project, or maybe there will be a follow-up project, and so on and so forth. But the kind of responsibility which is attached to internal impact and to the empty future that it is needed to imagine internal impact is not harm avoidance. So it's not only precaution, but it is more what Christina Rowling defines as epistemic responsibility. That is the sort of moral duty to be epistemically responsible for one's knowledge claims to a particular audience. And in this case, the particular audience is the scientific community. So maybe future work should actually try to explore the relation between the epistemic responsibility and harm prevention, whether epistemic responsibility is indeed necessary to develop harm prevention responsibility. And also what it is needed in order to think about internal impact in the future. Of course, what it is needed is the competence and the expertise that scientists already have, because they are precisely working to make such an impact, and they know already what it is needed in order for a research to have an internal impact. But of course, these researchers, they are aware that they are working in order to cure cancer. So they know that a pinpoint will have an impact outside of the laboratory and outside of the world of research and in the world of real people, of the people affected by cancer. But the problem here is how they conceptualize this other kind of impact. So I put here some examples of what I defined as external impact. Stan. So I asked Stan, who do you think is going to be affected by this kind of research project? And Stan made a very deep sigh. And then he said, who is going to benefit? I mean, the hope is always that we are able to deliver better treatment, right? Well, yes, right, but he himself could not answer to this question. Then there was Emily, that answering a similar question, she said that I hope cancer patients will get benefits from it, that is from people, from this research at some point. And you can see that here the kind of language is different, because when scientists talk about internal impact, they rely on what they know. They rely on their expertise, because they've been trained to make an internal impact on the research community. When they talk about external impact, the language becomes a little bit more confused with personal intuitions, personal hopes, but there is nothing too systematic. And also the time scale, the kind of future in which these external impacts will actually be obtained becomes extremely vague, no? So external impacts is to be had in a sort of, on what I defined at the beginning of this talk as a lived future. But the term in which this lived future will actually be accomplished is vague and indeterminate. When researchers talk about external impact, they usually rely on terms like sometimes, after we finish all the trials, at some point, and so on and so forth. Moreover, researchers themselves don't feel to be particularly responsible for making an external impact. So when talking about the external impact, usually the researchers think that the responsibility of the external impact of research will be on other people who are not themselves, namely the politicians or the clinicians at the hospitals, who might trust or not trust the AI-based device that they are developing, the patients themselves, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, even though external impact has to be had in the lived future, this lived future, it is lived, but it is lived by someone else, despite the fact that many researchers at Pinpoint are actually worried about cancer patients, and that are actually driven by social concerns. And the discourse on external impact and on the lived future of research is actually, as I said before, relies on hopes and personal intuitions. But I really want to stress that researchers talk about this about external impact in this way, not because they are indifferent or because they are immoral or because they don't care about the future of patients and the impact that their own research might have on cancer patients, but very often because they just feel that they don't know enough to actually anticipate this sort of impact, and they feel that they are not qualified enough to discuss external impacts. Again, here I did a little table with the different kind of impacts and different future, different terms, and so on and so forth. I want to add that in the case study, I also observed two remarkable deviations. So it must be said that, first of all, that the majority of the researchers are able to talk about the two different kinds of impacts. As I said, it's not that they don't have external impacts in mind, it's that they talk about external impacts in a different way, and they're not fully able to anticipate such an impact. But then the first deviation is the person, Thomas, that actually didn't even talk about the internal impact. So not even the impact that the research may have on the world of research, but the impact that this particular research can have on his own future. So asked on what this research will have an impact on, he said that this research will have an impact on my future career. And of course, I'm worried about things going wrong with Pinpoint because my academic livelihood depends on it. So in my way of conceptualizing personal impact, I see personal impact as a sort of extreme version of internal impact. Thomas thinks about both the short-term future because he's worried about something going wrong with his own experiments, but also about the long-term future. So he considers the effects that errors of dead ends at Pinpoint might have for his future in academia. And he thinks in this way because he's basically being responsible for himself and for his own future. So this is the first deviation. But then the second deviation is that on the total opposite extreme of the spectrum, there was one person that I categorized as a forward-looking researcher. This is a researcher who is actually able to anticipate in a very systematic way the external impact that Pinpoint can have. Is also able to anticipate what research on personalized cancer therapy will need to do in the next 15 or 20 years in order to have even a more impact. And he's even able to anticipate the potential problems with the implementation of the results of a personalized medicine in society. And for instance, the potential conflict with the national health system, right? So this person is Matthew. And then I wonder why he's able to anticipate external impact in such a clear and definite way. He's able to do so, first of all, because he's a principal investigator with a lot of experience on this kind of project. And above all, he's a very socially driven principal investigator. So he's not a principal investigator who's been working for 30 years only inside the lab, but he's always been involved with this science policy framework. And he's basically a sort of person who works on the relation between science and the Norwegian government. And therefore, he possesses a deep knowledge not only of biomedical research per se, but also of the political and institutional context in which research and innovation is embedded in. So going back to the problem of the tensions between individuals and groups, my question is, and this is an old question that I've already started to frame in previous works of mine. So in order for a research team to be responsible, should every single researcher in the team to be able to think about the future and to be responsible in the same way all the time? Not necessarily. My idea, this is an idea which I had already developed in a previous paper on the distribution of ethical labor. My idea is that exactly like the so-called cognitive labor theorized by social epistemologists is divided and distributed, sometimes even unevenly across research teams, so can also ethical labor work in the same way, which means that a few individuals who are responsible and who think about the future in a research team might contribute to the whole research team as a group to act responsibly. And I also found recently an antecedent to my position in the philosopher Heather Douglas. In this paper, she discussed what she defines the moral terrain of science, which for her is made by minimal standards, which she calls floors, and then ideal behaviors, which are the ideal ceilings. So in her view, in order for a research team to act morally responsible, it is enough that every single individual, of course, respect the minimal standards, which are the minimal standards of research integrities. And a few of these members of the research teams may engage in ideal behavior, but it would be too demanding and perhaps too unrealistic to expect that every single researcher is able to engage with this sort of future thinking. So in my view, and in Douglas' view, there is this sort of internal diversity in the distribution of ethical labor within research groups, which guarantees that research groups actually act responsibly. However, another problem that they noticed recently is that indeed the internal diversity of research teams cannot be taken for granted. So in the case of Pinpoint, the research team is indeed lucky because there is at least one person who is the forward-looking researcher who also occupies a position of power, and therefore he can conduct the whole group towards one direction rather than the other one. But we cannot take for granted that every single research team is designed in such a way to contain at least one forward-looking individual in a position of power, because this is also important. And then this is also related, so we should guarantee that at least more than one person engages in the ideal behavior and raises herself from the floor level of the minimal standards. But how can we guarantee such a thing? So the question here is whether we can learn to think about the future and to anticipate and predict the potential consequences of a piece of research. Which is tantamount to asking whether we can teach future thinking, to think about the future. So usually responsibility is discussed as a topic concerning morality. So usually the topic of responsibility comes up in the discussion about the conflict between the value-free versus the value-laden ideal of science, or the shift in idea of the social contract between science and society, and so on and so forth. And very often than not, it is also taught as such. And here, for instance, at the University of Oslo, there are a lot of RRI courses which are all about this shift in social contract between science and society, moral responsibility, and so on and so forth. However, little attention is paid to the kind of knowledge which is also necessary to anticipate certain impacts. If we want our researchers to be able to anticipate external impact, which is the impact that the researcher may have on the external context and therefore on society, scientists should be instructed how the institutions other than the scientific institution actually work. And then, of course, I don't want to reduce the topic of responsibility to a simple knowledge deficit, because of course the huge problem here is that knowledge of certain institutional dynamics can be necessary but not in itself sufficient. Responsibility is both an epistemic and a moral concept, because of course we can have extremely knowledgeable people who nevertheless are totally irresponsible, or they can be immoral. My favorite example is Alexander the Great, who knew a lot of things and whose teacher was Aristotle, but he was an extremely violent and immoral person. And then also the problem is, so even though we actually could find a way to teach responsibility and to teach how to engage in future thinking and anticipative reflection, the problem here is to whom we should teach these kind of things. So as it stands now, the whole debate on RRI, or the whole debate, the whole education curriculum of responsibility and so on and so forth is actually focusing on PhD students and postdocs, which are the junior scientists, so to speak. So even at the University of Oslo, there are these so-called RRI intensive course for giving some extra credit to the PhD students or to the postdocs. However, again, I'm afraid that this perspective is really unrealistic on how research teams and the world of research actually works. Because we all know, statistically speaking, the vast majority of PhD students will not keep on working in publicly funded research forever, because there's not enough demand and there is an exceeding offer. So many of them will actually leave and then they will go to work for private institutions to do research for the world of industry. But even those very few researchers who have received this responsibility training and who will keep on working in a publicly funded university and academic research, they will be in a subordinate position for a very long time. They will not become powerful principal investigator straight away. Very often they will jump from one postdoc to another postdoc for a few years, like myself, just to make an example. So in Pinpoint, on the other hand, we have the case, the strange case of this forward-looking scientist who is a principal investigator who can predict very well the future impact of his own research, and ironically enough has never attended any special course or seminar on responsible science. And is also in a position of power. So the problem with institutionalization of responsibility. So to institutionalize the responsibility, we should ask researchers to learn how to think the future. But it is an extremely complex task, and I'm not even entirely sure whether we can teach people to think about the future. And moreover, my idea is that the institutionalization of responsibility in science and technology is not a merely additive process. It is a transformative process, and transformations take a lot of time. We cannot simply ask researchers straight away to start thinking about the future impact of something that the future which they had never considered before, or they might not have enough knowledge to be able to engage in this kind of future thinking, because to think about the future, we need some sort of knowledge. Courses on the responsibility of science and technology might benefit individual researchers, but maybe they may not alter group dynamics, especially in the medium terms, because as I said before, the majority of the people who are receiving these courses on the responsibility of science and technology, they are not going to be in a position of power to making their voice count within the group. And basically, my idea is that if we want science and technology research to be responsible, we should focus less on educating junior researchers and even demanding junior researchers to learn more things that they've been trained for. And actually, the problem becomes the design of research teams to make sure that research teams actually contain that sort of a beneficial internal diversity that both Heather Douglas and I have been talking about for a while. And this is a partial bibliography. This is the title of the paper, which is under review.